This is tactical for us. We understand that after Bakhmut, they could go further. They could go to Kramatorsk, to Slavyansk. It would be an open road for the Russians after Bakhmut to other towns in Ukraine, in the Donetsk direction, in the east of Ukraine.
Sticking by that, and we've got new video and out front of the one road that could make all the difference when it comes to who ultimately controls Bakhmut, a town that Russians thought they would topple easily in 2 weeks, but now has been a place of hand-to-hand combat for more than 7 months. So this road is the only supply route for Ukraine's troops into the besieged city. It is a crucial route, right now covered in mud. Cars and trucks have been blown to pieces, and they line that muddy pathway, which is essentially what it is. But this is what's keeping Ukraine going and allowing it to push back against Russian soldiers who have been in continual disarray. And even tonight, new videos, just listen to this one, lashing out at their superiors.
I am refusing to obey orders after we took on losses in just 3 days. One reason being that our troops are not trained properly, yet sent to the front lines. It's completely f***ed up. We are dying left and right. Here's what's left of our company.
You can see only about 10 or a dozen men there, but I am refusing to obey orders, not just a complaint, an actual refusal to obey orders. It's not clear whether Putin is listening to this. For his part, he's rarely seen in public and rarely acknowledges the horrible struggle that his forces are facing on the front line. In a moment, I'm going to speak to a reporter who has exclusive new reporting on Putin's whereabouts and his lavish lifestyle with his reputed girlfriend, the former Russian Olympic gold medalist Alina Kabaeva. Russian independent journalist Roman Badanin reporting that this luxury mansion in Valdai is where Putin often stays. It's a home he can often get to by armored train, reportedly now his preferred way of travel, as we've told you. And tonight we have images reportedly of the interior. According to Badanin, the home is decked out in gold from Putin's office to his bedroom, which you can see here, to his so-called night cellar with gold dining chairs. And as for Putin's reputed girlfriend, Alina Kabaeva, a mansion was constructed about half a mile from Putin's home, where she apparently resides. Now, CNN can't independently verify these are images of Putin's homes because the Kremlin guards every detail of Putin's private life. But publicly, the Kremlin is struggling to silence growing criticism over the invasion and Putin's role in it. Melissa Bell is out front live in Kyiv tonight to begin our coverage. And Melissa, what is the latest on the ground tonight?
Aaron, Ukrainian forces continuing to hold on to Bakhmut despite the huge losses in infantry to both sides as Russian forces move ever closer to the city center. But Ukrainian attention tonight very much fixed on one soldier in particular, a Ukrainian man who went missing in early February. Glory to Ukraine were his last words. Timofey Shadura was his name. His courage and his silhouette made iconic overnight by his brutal execution. An officer from his brigade telling CNN that his death will not go unpunished.
Дуже боляче сприйняв таку варварську поведінку нашого ворога. Помста буде невідворотною. Так, Збройні сили України помстяться за смерть нашого товариша.
The fate of Bakhmut still in the balance. With dozens more attacks to the north of the besieged city and heavy losses to the Russian side, say Ukrainian authorities. But efforts to encircle Bakhmut praised by the Russian defense minister after an unusual trip to his soldiers in the occupied territories of Ukraine.
This city is an important defense hub for Ukrainian troops in Donbass. Taking it under control will allow further offensive actions deep into the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine.
The town also at the heart of a tussle between the Russian army and Wagner, the mercenary group planting its flag closer to the center of Bakhmut. Much of the fighting now street to street, soldier to soldier. As civilians cower in their basements, fewer than 4,000 now, say Ukrainian authorities, including 38 children. The ferocity of the artillery and mortar fire that continue to pound the city, making it hard even for soldiers to get out. And as Moscow closes in, more claims of so-called Ukrainian terrorist activity, with staunch Moscow ally Alexander Lukashenko announcing the capture of a Ukrainian-Russian national accused of trying to sabotage a Russian surveillance plane at a Minsk airfield, without presenting further evidence.
We identified and detained him. To date, more than 20 accomplices who are on the territory of Belarus have been detained.
Only last week, Moscow accused Ukrainian saboteurs of opening fire on civilians inside Russia. But even as the war of words widens, all eyes are very much on Bakhmut and whether this symbol of Ukrainian resilience will finally fall, even as a new one is born.
However long Aaron, Ukrainian forces managed to hold on to Bakhmut, whether it is a matter of hours or days, Kyiv says that it has already achieved its strategic ambitions, and they were twofold. First of all, degrading the Russian war machine, but also buying time as they prepare for a counteroffensive this spring.
All right, Melissa, thank you very much. Live from Kyiv tonight. And now, as promised, I want to go to Roman Badanin. He is a Russian journalist and the founder and editor-in-chief of the investigative journalism site Projekt, which has been targeted by the Russian government. He left Russia after facing the threat of a prison sentence. Roman, I really appreciate your time. And I mentioned your new investigation at the top of our program, your look inside Putin's real estate empire personally, inside Russia, and that of his reported girlfriend, Alina Kabaeva, with whom he apparently has multiple children. To what extent does Putin go through to keep that relationship and all that property and lifestyle secret?
Based on many facts that we discovered, I can say that Putin is absolutely 100% crazy about the secrecy around his personal life, about his relatives, and specifically about Kabaeva. Probably, I would say that Kabaeva is the biggest taboo in Russia.
And you have talked to 10 to 12 people in his inner circle, and they all know this is what's happening.
Yeah, they all are sure that Putin and Kabaeva is a family. But at the same time, none of them have ever seen Kabaeva and Putin together. That's the surprising. And I can give you like 3 short, very brief examples about the secrecy around Putin's personal life. As we reported, and as you mentioned, there is an armored secret train which is used by Kabaeva and Putin to get to the secret villas in Valdai region in northern Russia. Second, in 2008, it was a Russian tabloid called Moskovsky Correspondent, which first reported about the secret affair between Putin and Kabaeva. And this newspaper was forced to stop operation just in one day after the story was released. You can imagine, in one day. And the third example, we found a story about top professionals from Switzerland, the gynecologists who assisted Kabaeva to deliver her babies. And they were secretly transported, I would say, to Russia in 2019 just to help Kabaeva to deliver her baby.
And we're showing their picture there. You were able to even get pictures of them. And you shared these never-before-seen photos of what you say are the interior of Putin's house in Valdai. You know, the night room, as you describe it, the bedroom, all of this, the gold and opulence on display everywhere, right? An incredible amount of gold and gaudiness. You say this actually tells you something about Putin and the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's my main personal conclusion after this story was made. We have a 70-year-old man. He has a young girlfriend and small kids. And this man loves gold maniacally. And he loves his rich life very much. And does anyone believe that this man is ready to start a global atomic catastrophe, a global nuclear catastrophe? I don't believe.
It's very interesting because you think he's got too much at stake. I did it personally. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your taking the time and sharing all of this with us, Roman. I mean, it's incredible to see these images.
Thank you.
And let me go to Steve Hall now, the former CIA chief of Russia operations. And Steve, you look at these images. I mean, it is pretty incredible to see them and to imagine that that's, where he's living and spending his time. If he's able to, though, to hide that lifestyle and to hide the mother of multiple of his children so completely, it makes you wonder what else he's able to hide.
Yeah, Aaron, I mean, this is completely consistent with everything that I've ever heard or seen written about Vladimir Putin and indeed, the oligarch class in Russia. They do love their riches. They love their yachts. They love all of these things. Putin, though, goes to a real long extent to make sure that the Russian people are not aware of this. And this is precisely the same thing he's doing with the war with Ukraine. He doesn't want the real story to be getting out to Russians. Now, that was a lot easier 10, 15 years ago than it is today, where people are getting more access to the kind of reporting that Roman and his group, which is incredibly brave work, by the way, because they put themselves at direct risk from the security services. So it's great work, but it's harder and harder every day for Putin to try to hide the personal stuff about him, as well as to try to hide the really bad direction that Russia is going in generally, especially vis-a-vis Ukraine.
And Steve, what do you make of what we hear from some of those soldiers tonight? You know, one saying that they're literally defying orders. That we've heard the complaints, but to come out and say, I am defying orders, to say that, at least from what we've heard in this, you know, incredible volume of upset, angry soldiers, was different.
Yeah, also a very brave move. I'm not sure that it's good for one's longevity inside of the Russian military, but certainly brave. I mean, yeah, it continues to be clear. I think that the most recent numbers are that for every Ukrainian casualty on the side of the Ukrainian army, they're paying 5, 6, 7 Russian lives for that one Ukrainian life. The Russians do have a lot more people, so that's that works in their favor. But the other thing that works in their favor is there's a long history in Russia of these blocking brigades, which is basically professional soldiers, oftentimes with security and intelligence background, ready to shoot deserters on their shooting Russians. This is Russians shooting Russians to ensure that they obey orders, and if there is somebody who doesn't, that he doesn't stay around for long. So it's got to be a horrific situation for the Russians on the battlefields there in Bakhmut.
Right, to take that risk, to say it's worth saying this and putting this on Telegram if that's the cost. But what that means, those two choices are.
Both the Russian and Ukrainian armies have lost many of their best soldiers. And as the war drags on, that might be a big advantage for Russia, since it has access to far more troops. NPR's Frank Langfitt was recently near the front lines talking to Ukrainian soldiers in the Donbass, and he's here with me to talk about some of his reporting. Hey, Frank.
Hey, how you doing, Greg?
Good. So tell me where you went and who you talked to.
Yeah, so I was out in Kramatorsk, and this is the far eastern part of the country. It's a lot of flat land, and so you've heard about these artillery duels, but it's very flat farmland. And what I love to do, when I'm traveling in Ukraine, I love to just hang out with the soldiers in their safe houses, and these are, homes that they've taken over near the front lines where they operate out of. They cook, they sleep there, and that's a great place to talk to them because that's a time when they're not fighting and they have time to really talk about what they're seeing.
So you've brought us the story that you've filed about talking to soldiers, and we're going to listen to some of it now. Is there anything you want to say before we take a listen?
I just think that this gives you a little sense of what sort of normal life, to the degree that anything is normal in eastern Ukraine now, is like. This begins, I was just kind of hanging out with these guys outside in the morning, and they were just getting going, and this is kind of what it sounded like. Max is a Ukrainian sniper. This morning, he's oiling his rifle to AC/DC outside his reconnaissance team's safe house in the city of Kramatorsk in the east of the country. The team was operating in enemy territory the night before. They cleared a trench of 6 Russian troops that a fellow soldier had killed with a machine gun. The contents of the Russians' backpacks now lie on the ground outside the safe house. Pairs of socks, a magazine for an AK-47, 2 magazines, a grenade, several grenades. It's like just a little rubber band. Oh, these are just really terrible tourniquets. They're such poor quality. They're just little rubber strips. Andriy, the team leader, oversees more than 100 recon soldiers here.
Those people that we took these things from, they were really young, really young, no older than 25 years old. They have been provided with nothing.
Andriy says the dead soldiers were most likely convicts working with Wagner, the Russian mercenary group. He said they wore Ukrainian-style uniforms produced in Russia. Andriy describes their general tactics.
They approach our position saying, no, don't shoot. We are your people. This is how they try to get close to us. Our soldiers start to think, okay, it's our camouflage, so maybe it is our people. Until the last moment. In the case last night, they didn't know whether they killed their own or Russians.
So how are you sure that it wasn't your own people? We found their radios, their phone, Andriy says, which were Russian.
So, Frank, it sounds like That's just an illustration of how the two sides that are fighting are just very similar. They can't even tell each other apart sometimes.
Yeah, it was also just a chilling scene for me was to realize that the backpacks of these guys, and there wasn't much in them. I mean, it was really pretty pathetic that these were guys who'd been alive, 12 hours earlier, and they were all gone.
And can you describe a little bit where these Ukrainian soldiers were staying?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So you got to remember, Greg, as you know, no one planned for this war. So most Ukrainians didn't even think it was going to happen. So everything has been very ad hoc. And that means that if you're a reconnaissance team and you're out near the front, lots of people, of course, the vast majority of people have left. And so you take over homes. And in this case, what these guys did, they told me, is they actually kind of like broke into the home and they just started living there. And then the owner was called and he came and said, you guys didn't have to break in. I would have let you stay here. So they're now paying the utilities in the home. But what's interesting, Greg, when you're in these homes is this mix of domesticity and modern warfare. So I'll give you an example. This guy, Max, the guy who was oiling his rifle to AC/DC, he sleeps on this sofa and he uses a stuffed bunny for a pillow. Obviously one of the kids who used to live in the house. That's her bunny or his bunny. And on the floor next to the couch is a .50 caliber sniper rifle with this gigantic scope. Now, Andre, I really liked Andre and Max because they're totally different personalities and really interesting. Now, Andre, he's 30 years old. He's the more cerebral of the two. He studied history of the Middle Ages at university in Lviv and, in the far west of Ukraine where you've been. Yeah. And Max, he is 33 years old. And when I asked him sort of like his background, this is what he told me.
I was a football hooligan, and I was a farmer. This subculture of football hooligans, it's a small army. I have a feeling that my whole life, it was preparing me for this war.
Both he and Andre, who used to make dentures for a living, joined the army for patriotic reasons after Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Andre told me more about the Wagner convicts Ukraine is fighting.
They've been told you either sit in the prison or you'll get your freedom in the battlefield. They are now just used as meat. They push them in waves and waves and waves.
Max says the Russians sometimes also use new conscripts to draw Ukrainian fire to reveal their positions.
They picked the simplest way of working with less motivated troops. They push them forward under the threat of being shot. They just go until they stumble into the enemy. Then the Russians see where we are and say, let's drop artillery there.
Andre says, although Russian conscripts aren't well motivated, their numbers are huge.
The Russian mobilizational reserve is pretty much infinite, which means that they have the luxury to make mistakes. They can lose a brigade or they can lose a platoon, and some of those people are going to survive and they can share experience with the new conscripts.
In November, the Pentagon estimated both sides had lost more than 100,000 troops each to death and injury. But Andrei says the math is on Moscow's side. Russia's population is about 4 times Ukraine's. And Andrei says the Ukrainian army has motivational problems of its own.
Most of the people that were ready to take guns and fight, they came in the first 2 months, and those people are coming to an end.
Andrei means they're dead. He says the quality of the new soldiers is much lower. Some of them, he tells me, they don't know how to hold a rifle. And Max says, even if they do, there's some who don't want to use it. Max recalls a time in the Ukrainian city of Soledar, about 40 miles east of here, where his team prepared an ambush.
A group of Russian soldiers were leading a column, serving as the vanguard, and I saw a man at the front with a camouflage jacket and a Russian patch on it. He looked like he was walking at the front of a parade. He didn't know we were 50 to 60 meters from him. Then some of our guys did something stupid. They shouted at him, "Stop!"
Why did your soldiers tell him to stop?
Because you probably know the statistics. Not every soldier can kill when it comes to it. Since in Ukraine there are so many Christians, up to the last moment, they will try to not take a life. The funniest thing is, after I finished off the Russian soldier with 4 shots to his chest, and he fell down, all of our guys started to shoot.
Ukraine still vows to push Russian soldiers out of the country. President Volodymyr Zelensky had this message for those still living under occupation.
Ukraine hasn't abandoned you, hasn't forgotten you, hasn't forsaken you. One way or another, we will liberate all our lands.
The view from the front line is more skeptical. Andri's best case scenario is this.
We can be realists, and to speak as a realist, the conflict is going to be frozen.
Max has a worst case scenario. Russia takes the eastern half of Ukraine. After I met Max, he was injured in a firefight, taking shrapnel to his legs, arm, and elsewhere. He sent a voice memo from his hospital bed.
It was cowboy-style shooting. We started to think what to do next when shrapnel from a grenade hit my butt. Then they started to hit us with multiple grenade launchers from both sides. I crawled into the trench and they bandaged my butt. But since I was the leader of the group, I couldn't let the guys simply die. So I took a rifle and I started firing back.
Well, Frank, thank you so much for bringing this portrait of these guys who are fighting for Ukraine. How is Max doing? Have you heard from him?
I was in touch with him just yesterday. He's doing better. He told me that all the bandages are off and they are transferring him to a hospital in Lviv. He was actually in Kharkiv, out in the sort of the northeast, and so he's on his way, I think, to Lviv by now.
Yeah, I was struck in the story about how blunt these guys were about losses and death and how many Russian soldiers would be coming at them and how unprepared their colleagues were.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I love about this work as a reporter is hanging out with guys for a couple days and just asking them the most obvious questions about their work, which is war. And some of them are extremely direct. There's no bravado. They don't try to tell a story about how heroic they are. Yeah. They're very straightforward about the challenges that they face. And that's why I find sometimes these kinds of sets of interviews are the most illuminating for me as a reporter in Ukraine.
Well, speaking of illumination, I mean, you were in Ukraine on the day the invasion started. We're over a year on now.
Yeah.
When you're thinking about this particular reporting trip that you just concluded, what were some surprises? What were some unexpected things that you learned?
I think the thing of listening to Max and Andriy is that they're not very optimistic, as you can tell.
Yeah.
And they're talking really about the numbers. The money quote for me in probably the entire interview is Andriy saying the Russian mobilization reserve is pretty much infinite.
Yeah.
And I just thought, well, that says a great deal. I mean, that's a huge challenge. And neither of them were like upbeat about being able to take lots more territory. Another thing is where this contrasts with a lot of the earlier interviews I've done, it was always focusing on weapons. Give us the HIMARS and we'll do this. Give us the M777 howitzers from the Americans and we'll do this. And the weaponry has been very, very valuable. But there's a reality with numbers here. And one of the concerns in talking to a really good analyst here in London, where I am right now at the Royal United Services Institute, is he says, what happens if the Russians eventually get their act together? The Russian dysfunction in this war has been the greatest advantage the Ukrainians have had. I cannot emphasize that enough.
Yeah.
What if their supply chains get better? What if they actually train these guys a bit better? And that's the concern from a Ukrainian perspective. With those big numbers, and if they have better soldiers, it's going to be tougher and tougher to take territory and keep territory.
You can't rely on dysfunction as of your enemy as a strategy.
And the Russians are learning. I mean, everybody makes fun of the Russians, and there's a good reason for that. The beginning of the war was mind-blowingly chaotic from the Russian perspective.
The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres will hold talks with President Zelensky in Kiev today about the continued export of Ukrainian grain. A deal brokered by the United Nations and Turkey to enable the shipping of Ukrainian grain via the Black Sea was secured with Russia last year, but is due for renewal. The Ukrainian MP, Kira Rudik, said reaching a new deal won't be easy.
We know how many people in the whole world also depend on our grain. And this is a very complicated political task. We understand that. But we were willing to execute from our side with all honesty and every single step of the way. The question that everybody's trying to figure out now, and it's a bigger question, is how do you make Russia to honor the agreement?
Russia has signalled that it wants more to be done to lift curbs on its own agricultural exports before it agrees to an extension. The United States and the European Union have criticised a draft law in Georgia which would require companies to register as foreign agents if they receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad. Thousands of demonstrators descended on Parliament in Tbilisi after the bill was approved. The US State Department spokesman Ned Price said Washington was very concerned.
This draft law would strike at some of the very rights that are central to the aspirations of the people of Georgia. It would stigmatize and silence independent voices and citizens of Georgia who wish to do nothing more than work together to build a brighter future.
4 bankers go on trial in Switzerland today, accused of helping to hide millions of dollars that could belong to President Vladimir Putin. They're all senior executives at the Zurich branch of Gazprom Bank. Prosecutors say they did not carry out due diligence regarding the account of a Russian cellist, Sergei Roldugin. Imogen Folks is in Geneva.
Sergei Roldugin is a cellist with a modest income, so how was he able to put millions of dollars into a Swiss bank account? This is the question Zurich prosecutors say the 4 accused should have asked. It was well known that Roldugin was a close friend of Vladimir Putin's. Under Swiss law, banks are required to reject or close accounts if they have doubts about the account holder or the source of the money.
The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has said media reports about last year's sabotage attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines are an attempt to divert attention. Speaking to the Russian news agency RIA, Mr. Peskov said he was perplexed by a report in the New York Times newspaper suggesting a pro-Ukrainian group was responsible for the attacks. It cited anonymous US intelligence officials who stressed there was no evidence the Ukrainian government itself was involved. World News from the BBC. A former director of the US Centers for Disease Control is to testify to the congressional panel established to look into the origins of COVID-19. Dr. Robert Redfield led the CDC during the outbreak. He believes the virus came from a laboratory leak in China, which Beijing denies. From Washington, Gary O'Donoghue reports.
Almost 3.5 years after COVID-19 first appeared in the world, there's still no answer to the question, how did it come about? To date, neither the World Health Organization nor the United States has come down in favour of one explanation or the other, and China has continued to block access to key data from the lab in question. There have also been accusations that some scientists, without evidence, attempted in the early days to paint any hypothesis based on a lab leak as tantamount to a conspiracy theory. Republicans are frustrated that the Biden administration has so far resisted any kind of bipartisan commission to look into the origins of COVID.
Media reports from Taiwan suggest President Tsai Ing-wen will travel to the United States next month and meet the Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Taiwanese and US officials have been anxious that such a meeting could further inflame tensions with China. The chief executive of Twitter, Elon Musk, has apologized over an online exchange with an employee, Thorleifson, who had spent more than a week trying to work out whether he'd been sacked. It now appears Twitter's owner has offered him his job back. Mr. Musk said he'd had a video call to establish the facts and apologise for misunderstanding Mr. Thorleifson's situation.